Welcome to the Toronto Real Estate Podcast, where we jump into the heart of the market, unpacking the latest trends, changes, and insights that affect you, whether you're buying, you're selling, or just wanting more information. Today, we are tackling a massive shake-up in the real estate marketplace with recent legislation changes in the US that are sending ripples across the border up here to Canada. We're going to discuss what this means for buyers, sellers, and real estate professionals like us. My name is Kori Marin. I'm the broker and co-founder of Fox Marin. And this is my partner in crime, Mr. Ralph Fox, broker of record and co-founder at Fox Marin. Oh, and please don't forget to like, subscribe, or comment if you find this information today here valuable. It means so much to us. So, Ralph, we are going to talk about a topic that is coming down the pipeline in real time. We are treading new waters. You and I really have not had a discussion about this. So for our audience today, this is the first time Ralph and I are unpacking this information. I think it would be really helpful to talk about this as if we're totally newbies about it. And let's just talk about pros, cons, and everything in between so our audience can stay informed and you and I can do some learning along the way. How does that sound?
Absolutely. I mean, I think right now everybody is a newbie who's looking at this because this is only it's a proposed settlement, but this proposed settlement is only a few days old. There's a lot of discussion right now as to how big of an impact that this will have on the way real estate is traded in the United States, which will obviously trickle down into Canada, probably in short order. So being perched up here in Canada and watching everything that's going on right now in the US is really, really important because whatever happens there probably will come to play here in Canada in one form or another. It's a really, really big shakeup, it looks like, but this can sort of move in a whole bunch of different directions. And it's really a question of just understanding where we're at now and trying to anticipate where this is all going.
Okay, let's take a step back. So let's just have a brief overview of this proposed settlement. So for our audience, there is a new settlement coming into play between NAR, which is the National Association of Realtors in the US, current litigation right now with the DOJ, the Department of Justice. I feel like I'm in a crime show when I say the DOJ, and its immediate effects on real estate transactions in the U.S. specifically. Can you just give a brief overview? Because some people might not know even what we're talking about right now.
For sure. And there's a few things just in your statement that I'm going to correct as I go along as well. So the NAR is the National Association of Realtors. It has 1.5 million members, which is huge. As far as I understand, it is the largest trade organization in the United States. And they collectively represent the industry of realtors in the US. There have been a series of lawsuits all across the United States, class action lawsuits by consumers, and they have been suing brokerages, a lot of the bigger brokerages like the Keller Williams and the Berkshire Hathaways of the world, and also NAR. And so there was a really big case called the Seitzer-Burnett case. And it was either in Kansas City or Missouri, one of those states, in a class action lawsuit. And very big case. And within about 1 hour after a jury deliberated, they came back and made a decision and awarded the plaintiffs $1.8 billion. But somehow that number could have tripled into $5 billion. And that was just one suit. And there were a number.
What was this suit? What was this suit about?
Basically, it was about commissions. And they were saying that they felt that the sellers, that they were forced to compensate buyers and that the buyers' agents' compensation wasn't negotiated. It was just packaged into the seller's compensation. And so
the buyer's compensation, the buyer agent's compensation.
Basically is the way the model of real estate, both in Canada and the United States, has worked up until now, is that a seller, when they list a property on MLS with a selling agent, will compensate both the selling agent and the buyer agent. So a little bit different structuring in the US, but typically in Canada, it's normally 5%, with the typical 2.5% going to the selling agent and 2.5% going to the buying agent all of which is paid for by the seller on close.
And which is disclosed upfront in advance and is disclosed on the MLS listing itself. You'll see at the very bottom on the broker version of an MLS listing how much the seller is paying commission to the buyer agent.
Correct. And with any offer, there's something called the confirmation of cooperation, where all parties sign off acknowledging how much commission is being paid and by whom, which is typically in advance, pre-negotiated by the selling agent. There was this very big case awarded, it looks like it would have ended up close to $5 billion to the actual claimants. And that was just one suit. There was about 20 copycat suits all over the US going on with similar type arguments against organized real estate. So real estate brokerages and against NAR.
And they're saying, let's just even dumb this down a little bit more. They're saying that it's not fair that it's pre-negotiated,
yes,
the commissions before a property is listed to go to market. Is that correct? Is that the dumbest way to say it?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
And so they were claiming damages that they shouldn't have had to have paid for the buyer commissions, essentially.
Interesting.
That was in play. Now, simultaneous to that, about maybe a month ago, 6 weeks ago, the DOJ, the Department of Justice in the United States, also threatened to intervene. And what they were talking about is they wanted to see a decoupling of commissions from the seller's agents and from the MLS.
Okay.
Arguing that the buyer's agent or the buyers should have a right to negotiate their own compensation up front.
Okay.
Secondarily to that, they were concerned about a practice called steering, where the idea is that some agents, unscrupulous agents, would steer their clients away from properties offering lesser commission to offer properties that are offering higher commission.
And I think that actually does happen.
And they felt, I don't think it does as much, but that's a separate conversation. But they felt that both of those practices were anti-competitive and that they were going to go after the industry and NAR if they didn't take action. And so the real concern was not the lawsuits. The bigger concern was the Department of Justice coming in and taking action arbitrarily. And so what NAR has done is they made a settlement, and that settlement in turn would absolve all 1.5 million agents working at brokerages that make incomes less or with revenues less than $2 billion. Over $2 billion, they would have to end up in their own settlements. And already I know Keller Williams and some of the Remaxes of the world had made settlements in advance of NAR. The only one right now that doesn't have a proposed settlement, interestingly enough, that's large, is Berkshire Hathaway, which is interesting. They're still out there on the sides. So, these are just
fighting the fight.
Well, these numbers are just rounding errors to Warren Buffett. So we'll see where that all plays out. And the other thing to understand is that this is just proposed, the settlement, and there are aspects to the settlement, and that we'll get into that in a second. But presuming that a court approves the settlement that was reached and the Department of Justice is satisfied with the terms of this settlement, then these new changes will take effect in the United States. It's either like mid or end of July. So,
and just to be super clear, sorry, Ralph, the settlement is between NAR and the brokerages, correct? And the DOJ is the one that's sort of the intermediary between the two?
The settlement is between the plaintiffs who are suing NAR. And as part of that settlement, they're bringing in terms to satisfy the Department of Justice so that they don't intervene. So when one swoop, they're trying to make a payment that ends all the litigation. That's $400 some odd million, and then make changes to the MLS system and the way realtors conduct themselves specific to buyers' commissions that would satisfy the Department of Justice so that the litigation would end and the Department of Justice would not intervene.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Who started all of this?
Not me. Not me.
It is a little complicated, I have to admit, when it comes up on news feeds or whatever. I read about it and then I'm like, I don't even know how to unpack this. Like you even describing it to me in layman's terms, I'm still wrapping my head around it. So I'm so happy we're having this conversation.
100%. And none of this is even solidified yet via the courts. So this could still change over the next couple months. And then the repercussions of all of this are really interesting. And then how that affects what happens in Canada is also a bit of an outlier as well. So there's a lot of layers to it. But essentially, the National Association of Realtors has agreed to pay $418 million.
Mm-hmm.
All realtors and brokerages working at brokerages that have less than $2 billion in revenues will be part of this settlement in terms of no longer having to be culpable to any compensation or any actions by NAR.
With Berkshire being the holdout.
I know Berkshire, they haven't made any settlement yet, and they're not covered in this NAR proposed settlement. So they're still out there, but I'm sure they'll fall in line at some point in time, especially if this gets ratified in the courts. So the two major considerations is that offers of brokers' compensation cannot be communicated via the MLS.
Okay.
And cannot be pre-negotiated by sellers' agents. So what the Department of Justice wanted to see was a decoupling of commissions that's paid to the selling agent and to the buyer agent. So now, if you are a buyer agent, you will have to negotiate your commissions to be payable either by your client, the buyer.
So the buyer will have to pay the buyer agent direct?
Potentially. Or the seller could still compensate the buyer's agent, but that would have to be worked out in an agent-to-agent conversation because it can't be advertised on MLS. Or via the actual written offer. It could be worked into the offer, somehow structured into an offer.
Okay, let's just recap that again. So one, the buyer agent can negotiate their commissions directly with their own client, the buyer. Number two, the buyer agent and the selling agent can negotiate commissions in advance of submitting an offer. Or three, it's structured into the offer paperwork itself and becomes part of the back and forth negotiation on terms, price, closing date, and commissions as an example.
Correct.
Okay. And the selling commission, is there any change to the selling commission?
No.
Okay.
In terms of the way it's negotiated or structured, no.
That is set up front in your initial listing contract as we've been doing up to now.
Correct. Now, there's some interesting areas to this. So that's the first change, and we'll just go through the second change, the major change, is that NAR has agreed to enact a new rule where all buyer agents have to have a signed buyer representation contract with the buyer prior to showing them a property, right up front.
Okay. So that would be similar to what we have here in Ontario and Canada called the buyer representation agreement.
Right. But it's a best practice here to get that signed up front. But it is something that has to be signed when you're actually representing a client and offering on the property. So there is a slight difference there.
Okay, so it would be a mandatory requirement.
Exactly. And that could, and I'm not clear about this, but that could indicate how the buyer agent is being paid or potentially from whom as representing the buyer.
What I find confusing about this, and I know we had a brief conversation about it. So you have your contract with your buyer, you're a buyer agent. You have a contract with your buyer. You have this signed before you do your first showing, get all that. But negotiating the commission structure in advance of negotiating with the seller and the seller agent seems very confusing to me.
Well, that could be amended.
That's true.
So it's like, okay, they're going to pay 1.5% and you would need to pay 1% to bring me up or whatever it is. And this is still a known unknown. So I'm not sure practically how this is going to work, but there's also some really interesting things that could come out of this in terms of models. So the first thing that I find really interesting is while a seller's agent is not allowed to advertise commission payable to a buyer agent from the seller on MLS, there is absolutely nothing prohibiting the selling agent to post the commission on their website or on a third-party site. So then you have to ask the question, a larger question is, well, if that's the case, then why would anyone need to use MLS?
Right.
So the whole future of MLS and how listings are marketed or advertised now comes into play. And you look at places like New York City, which I didn't know this, but New York City is not part of NAR, the agents, and they're not part of MLS.
What?
They're their own being.
Island.
Exactly. So how that all plays out, in other areas is very, very interesting here. So,
Can I just say one thing about that too? Is we already talked to our clients about how limited MLS really is, and that we encourage a lot of our storytelling and marketing to take place on our website and our social media assets, because we can show more photos, we can tell a bigger story, we can add more copy, we can add more attachments and downloads, and like all the information's there. Because MLS, and we said this in previous podcasts, if you viewers were behind the scenes on MLS, you'd think we were working on like DOS 1992 back there. It's like very archaic and clunky and slow and limited as to how much information we can tell about a seller's property. So it'd be so interesting if that was abolished and then everything sort of moved freelance style into people's own marketing tools.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating.
Ooh, juicy.
And the other thing that's really potentially interesting, it doesn't exist today, but there may be lenders who might be willing to add in buyer agent commissions into a mortgage. So, for example, if somebody offered $1 million on a property, they could offer $1,025,000, and that extra $25,000 is built into the mortgage payments. And so the buyer doesn't really feel it, but the buyer has representation and it's paid for if the seller isn't willing, or even if there's some type of a partial workaround between the buyer and seller. So lenders may be able or willing at some point in time to finance this. And what's interesting is there's a new startup renegade association in the US. I think it's called AREA. Scandals there with inappropriate behavior by some of its leadership. And so all kinds of things are coming out of NAR, which is a 100-plus-year-old organization with 1.5 million members, that may come out with there's a whole new organization or whole new structure that's really guiding the industry. So things are really, really being shaken up right now, and it'll be very interesting to see how this all plays out.
Quick question for you, Ralph. The whole thing with the mortgages and rolling in the buyer commissions into the mortgage, I actually think that's not a bad idea. Is anyone in the world doing that right now? Or is this something that's just been floated out there?
Don't know. But I know it's something that is definitely could be possible if lenders are willing to do it.
I think that's really interesting.
So we'll see. And there's many other ways that this can go as well. But I think it's, for the most part, really, really interesting.
I do too. Okay. Let's just talk about this, because I think yesterday you told me that 40 to 70%, if that's correct, of agents may leave the business in the US due to these changes. Is that true?
Depends. So some
40
people,
to 70%?
Some people are saying that the realtors in the US could go from 1.5 million down to 500,000. So, and I don't think that would be a bad thing here in Toronto either. But it really depends on how this plays out. I think the most important things to recognize is that consumers and the Department of Justice feel that realtors are not adding enough value or having the opportunity to show how they add value. And as somebody in the industry, knowing how much value a good and competent and professional and experienced buying agent can add to the process, I think it's a really good opportunity to change the industry from a lot of part-timers to professionals, and to go from an amateur sort of industry into a highly professionalized industry where the competent and the hardworking and the experienced who can show that they add value can really, really change the way I think our industry is perceived. And I think a lot of this dislike towards agents comes from, these shows, these reality shows where people are just sitting around making millions of dollars, and in trading, real estate, when in fact, if you actually look up their stats, they're doing absolutely no business and they're not even really agents in some instances, or certainly active agents. And so, the selling sunsets of the world aren't really helping. And I think the perception that buyer agents are for free because it's all built in and paid for by the seller really diminishes people's respect for what a competent buyer agent does. And in some markets, it might be understandable, but in tight inventory markets where things sell very quickly, or you have basements, that are 120 years old, or you have, areas that are changing so dramatically with things moving so quickly, like if you look at all the changes with AI and websites and third-party websites and opening up information, that hasn't led to less realtors being used on transactions. It's actually equated to more. And I think the more transparent and the more choices people have as consumers, it's not necessarily a bad thing at all. But I think that there needs to be ways that buyers are able, especially if they can't afford it, and sellers are unwilling to pay for buyer agents, that there's a way that buyers can have top professional representation, because it really, really is something that's important and warranted, especially if you've been in the business this long. You see how important it is to the process.
Oh my gosh. Let's just talk about that for a second. Let's talk about some key ways that a buyer agent, a good buyer agent, adds value to the process. And I'll kick the answer off to this. I think market analysis, pricing analysis, education. So about the process in general, because it's very overwhelming. Offer structure, offer timing, area gentrification, area research. Oh my God, so many things. Adding value over time. Why is a property good to buy now? Because, in 10 years, your return on investment is going to equate to X, Y, Z. That's a big part of it. Navigating emotions, navigating different points of view from family members, navigating the bank of mom and dad. I mean, there's just so many things that you are dealing with. Oh, let's just also add in the fact that a lot of the time, entry-level properties are selling in multiple offers, so more than one offer in a bidding war scenario, and or selling in a preemptive offer or a bully offer. That's really challenging to navigate. The hours that you're working, so you're working generally like 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. and every Saturday and Sunday. Those are just like a few things off the top of my head. Do you want to add anything to that in terms of a good agent?
I think you did a good job. I think there's a misconception because a really good agent will talk his client out of offering on more properties than they ever consider offering on, because they're there to look after the fiduciary best interests of their clients. And so if somebody doesn't know anything about the market, about houses, about condos, about pricing, about really understanding their long-term goals and their family dynamics, and all of the things that go into making such a significant investment, if they don't have professional advocate on their behalf, and they're just walking in and they're not being represented, it's a real travesty. And I think that's potentially, unless the market really can adjust in the right way, and I think it will, I think potentially the buy side will be maybe the biggest losers in all of this. I think the lawyers are going to be the biggest winners. They're getting hundreds of millions of dollars in this settlement. And I always find that really interesting because they're arguing about commission and being overpaid. And, they're getting 40% or even higher of this award. So they're making hundreds of millions of dollars. The claimants are going to make nothing. And, the argument about being overpaid is kind of ironic looking at how they're going to end up as a result of this litigation.
Wow. Okay, let's just move on a little bit here. So the sellers are expected, I know it's not really for sure yet, to save millions and billions, I guess, in commissions overall with this new settlement. Do you think that's going to have any impact? So let's just say they're paying a little bit less on their commissions when they sell a property. Will that impact housing prices?
No.
You don't think so?
No, because housing prices are determined by supply and demand. And the seller is going to try and get absolutely as much as they can for their property. And that's what the listing agent's job is going to be to continue to do. And it will be determined by scarcity. And we in Toronto traditionally are in a market, maybe not as much at this point in time in condos, but certainly in low-rise homes. And condos will shift very shortly where we're just perpetually undersupplied. The supply and demand will always determine the sale price of a home, not realtors' commissions. It just won't have that big of an effect.
And I always think that's a misperception as well from the consumer, that they're thinking, oh, we want them to pay more on the property because we're going to make more, and they're like, you just want us to offer up more because you're going to make more commission. I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm not even thinking about this at all, first of all. And also like an extra 10,000 topping up your offer doesn't really affect our bottom line that much. Not that I'm even thinking about it. Yeah. But they think that.
It could be $100,000, that extra $2,500 after splits and taxes, versus looking out for your client's best interest and long-term making sure they're happy and taken care of.
My God.
It's not even a consideration.
It's not even like on our minds at all.
It isn't. And so the market will determine, based on supply and demand, the value of a property. And so it will have no impact on prices in Toronto.
Mark Ralph Fox's words right now. Bookmark this section. Okay, so given the close ties between US and Canada, obviously, you think that there is definitely a potential ramification of all of this floating up here. And if so, when would that roll out, do you think?
So what's interesting is there are similar copycat class action litigations happening in Canada right now.
Talk to me.
So they're still earlier in the court system, probably years away, potentially, from these cases being heard and argued and decided on. But clearly, CREA, which is the Canadian Real Estate Agency or Canadian Real Estate Association, did put out a statement soon after this proposed settlement came out in the United States by NAR, saying that while there are differences in the way our systems are run, and there are factual differences in the litigation that's pending between what's going on in the United States and here, they are watching very closely what's happening in the United States, and they'll, make, further announcements as time goes on. So, and that makes sense. Like even the term realtor, the trademark, that's shared. So there's a lot of synergies between the way business is done in our two markets. And so it definitely will have an impact, but generally what happens in the United States happens there first and then moves up to Canada. So we'll be watching to see the various models of how this all pans out and how this could shape the way real estate is traded. There are some who are saying, similar to what's happening in Australia, that there might not be buyer agents, and this could be death and end of buyer agents, which is different to something else than we've been talking about up until this point.
And so Australia doesn't have buyer agents at all?
They do. From what I've read, like 10% of transactions are carried out with buyer agents. Okay. The rest are where buyers are buying direct from listing agents. And in that instance, that's the sort of Armageddon instance where some are projecting if that's the direction that this moves, then you could see probably 1 million agents out of the US gone.
But then all of a sudden, the selling agent is now responsible for getting the highest price for their seller and then also the best price for their buyer. That's where I feel like there could be some issues with
100%.
Ethical terms.
100%. 100%.
And if there's no buyer agent, I know we're just talking hypothetically and we're just brainstorming around all of these newbie things that we don't even know what's going to happen. If there was no buyer agent, how would buyers see properties? They would just, I guess, go to open houses?
Yeah.
Or book directly to the selling agent?
Or go to open houses. And so the selling agents would really drive the market as it does in places like Australia.
So interesting.
It will be very, very interesting. So there's different ways that this can play out, and there's different models. Some are suggesting there might be a space for real estate buyer consultants where they'll just come in and, hey, I'm thinking about offering on this property, 152 Main Street. And you get the call and you're like, okay, for $5,000, I'll come, I'll look at the property, I'll meet with you, I'll help talk to your mortgage broker, I'll make sure the property's fine, I'll look at the paperwork for you, I'll help you negotiate, and it'll just be specific to this one property. Like that's one type of model that could come out of this. There's so many different models that could come out of this. And I think ultimately it's really going to come down to how we in our industry show our value.
Yes.
And how professional we are. And then what in turn consumers really now confronted with the reality of buying direct, which some seem to, on Instagram say that they want, or, on Twitter say that they want. And I think they've been for a cold reality, trying to sort of sort all of this out. And so where the middle ground is will be really interesting to see. And I don't think anybody really knows or predicts, but it is going to bring in greater transparency into the market, which isn't a bad thing. It's going to allow for new models, and maybe it will create an opportunity for the general public and consumers to have a better appreciation for the work that we do when we do the good work that we do.
And do you think there's any ways that agents should be preparing for these shakedowns now?
Yeah.
What should they be thinking about?
Being able to add more value than anybody else, never taking anything for granted in terms of a client, and always, always, always striving to give the best possible representation and experience to your client, be it a buyer or seller. You do that in any market, actually in any business or industry.
So true.
You're going to do really, really well. And I think a lot of agents, newer agents, part-time agents, inexperienced agents, lazy agents tend to work on the buy side, and they'll get, one or two clients and try and get that pre-negotiated commission of 2.5%. That's no longer going to be there. So now they're going to have to show value, and now they're going to have to compete. And so I think that's really important, because as a selling agent or listing agent, sometimes it's really embarrassing to see the representation that buyers have, not even knowing that the paperwork is a mess, or that they're overpaying for a property, or that they're missing out on key things that a competent agent would have helped protect them from.
Oh, so true. Like, I remember the first time I sold a property and I was on the listing side. And this is back in the day when buyer agents would come and present their offers in person. So everyone would be sitting in their cars outside, and then one by one, the buyer agents came and showcased their offer. I presented their offer to the listing agent. And I sat through, 10 offer presentations. And I have never felt my confidence boost so much over a 2-hour period, because I just saw how negligible all of these buyer agents were and incompetent they were representing their buyers, to the point where I was like, I feel sorry that this poor buyer is sitting outside in this car with this agent, and this is their representation. This is horrible. Just so many errors in the paperwork, no deposit check, weird terms and conditions, no polish, no ability to articulate themselves, like no presentation skills. I was like, what? I just was flabbergasted. So yes, buyers out there, please make sure you're working with somebody who's adding value to the process, because there's just a lot of really, really bad agents out there. There really are. There's a lot of great ones too. And we know a lot of them. There's a lot of great ones.
And I think the great ones are going to continue to flourish, and maybe even have the opportunity to excel in this type of environment. So it's not a bad thing necessarily for agents, for the good ones. It's not necessarily a bad thing for the industry. And it might not be a bad thing for consumers. It really just depends on how this all flushes out in the new paradigm. So it would be super interesting to see. It's still very early days. The post-settlement hasn't even been approved in the courts yet. But I think watching this unfold in the United States is going to be really, really interesting, because a lot of that is going to impact how things are done up here sooner rather than later.
I found this such a super valuable conversation. I am so glad that we decided to use this as our topic today.
For sure.
Are there anything else that you want to add, just so you think it would be valuable to the viewers today? Or did we cover everything off that we know about and we can share today?
I think we covered it all off for now, for sure.
My gosh, love it. Ralph, you're the best. Well, that wraps up a super insightful Toronto real estate podcast. And if you found today's discussion valuable, please don't forget to hit that like button or drop us a comment. Please be nice if you can. And no one has to say that my introduction rattled on too long. Thank you very much, commenters. Your thoughts and questions are great. Please subscribe, stay up to date with the latest in Toronto real estate. And your engagement always helps us grow and bring new insights to the channel. Ralph, thank you so much. Audience, thank you so much. Have a wonderful, wonderful day, and we'll see you on the flip side.